J-curve effect. As we have seen in the previous video, when rupee depreciates, I said exports becomes cheaper, henceforth they tends to rise, and imports becomes costlier, and that might lead to fall in imports. That might lead to trade surplus for a country. Trade surplus for a country. I mean to say a situation where exports would be greater than imports. But if you look at the increase in exports or fall in imports is something that's not going to happen immediately. Now let's say when your goods becomes cheaper, it all depends upon the elasticity of exports or the rate at which exports increases with fall in value of rupee. In general, it might take certain time for rupee to or people to notice the fall in rupee, and for that to get reflected on the export potential of a country, because as soon as your rupee experiences depreciation, it is not that people tend to demand too many of Indian products. It takes for certain time for India to take an advantage of increase in exports for the fall in value of rupee. But when it comes to the impact of rupee depreciation on imports, the imports immediately becomes costlier. So what in general is going to happen, the immediate consequence of rupee depreciation is the further worsening of existing trade deficit. Further worsening of existing trade deficit. I mean to say, let's say a country like India whose imports are more than exports, henceforth it is said to have a trade deficit. What is going to be the impact of rupee depreciation is, since imports becomes costlier and exports though becomes cheaper, since it takes certain amount of time for India to realize this advantage, but whereas you need to make a higher amount of rupees, more rupees for dollars in order to meet your import requirement. What is going to happen? The immediate consequence is the trade deficit worsens. And this worsening of trade deficit initially and the gradual recovery, let's say this is trade deficit. The positive, when it is positive, you are said to have a trade surplus, and when it is negative, let's say instead of saying trade deficit, I would call it as trade surplus, balance of trade. So it is positive, does mean you are said to have trade surplus. When it's negative, you are said to have trade deficit. On x-axis, let's take the time period. Now just say country like India, which is having a trade deficit as of now, which is having a trade deficit of this level. Since the imports becomes costlier in the immediate period and it takes certain time for exports to increase, for a certain period of time you experience the worsening of trade deficits, and once India starts taking the advantage of cheaper exports because of rupee depreciation, the trade deficit slowly might recover, and henceforth after certain point of time you might enter into a positive territory, wherein after certain duration you experience positive balance of trade. This is generally what we call as J-curve effect, since the curve more or less look like J, and this is what we call as J-curve.